Okay. Again, this is Sally Orcutt with Client Feedback Tool. Thanks for joining us. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our speaker for today. Denise is an experienced entrepreneur and consultant who finds inspiration at the busy intersections of organization development, knowledge management, strategic innovation, and complexity models for business success. She's the co-founder of Complexity Space Consulting and the founder and CEO of Adapt Knowledge. Her work focuses on helping clients build adaptive, innovative, and financially successful organizations by understanding and influencing the dynamics within their unique complex systems. Denise works across the corporate, public, education, and nonprofit domains, which has provided the foundation for her research and thinking on the synthesis of complexity science, business applications, human systems, and organization design and strategy. She's been published in numerous publications, most recently completing a chapter on knowledge management and organization development for a book on organization change and transformation. She's a frequent speaker and panelist on the topic of complexity in organizations, technology, and adaptive knowledge management practice. And personally, it's been a pleasure to work with you, Denise, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much. I am going to, let's go to the next slide. Welcome, everybody. I'm really appreciative of you all being here as well. And here we are. Sally, if you'd like to just go over the technology use, then I can just jump right back in.
Great. Yes, for those of you who may not be familiar with GoToWebinar, if you want to minimize the panel on the side, there's an orange button at the top, and you can just click that, and it'll minimize that arrow. And to adjust your screen size, there's a button at the bottom right-hand corner that will allow you to adjust screen size. One other thing I'd like to mention is that Denise will be taking questions throughout, or rather, if you would put your questions in the question box throughout the webinar, then I will put them out for the chat to the entire audience, and we'll respond to as many as we can. Denise, I'm getting a little feedback on your end from your mic.
Oh, okay. Well, I will make sure. Let me see if I can just lower that a tad. Would that be helpful? Oops, we want to go back to here. Sorry. Okay.
That sounds good. That sounds good.
Does that sound good? Okay, perfect.
So I'm going to turn it back over to you now, Denise.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to be with us. I'm very excited to be here for several reasons. One, as Sally mentioned, I have been involved in knowledge management, and I have done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of webinars. We were one of the first companies for Adapt Knowledge to really use this new virtual technology. And the reason I mention that is because when you're on the other side, it's one thing to work with clients and to help them produce the session, and then when you're the presenter, it gives you another perspective. And one of the things that we'll be talking today from a knowledge capital situation is what are the perspectives that we have and how can we shift them within any organization and make it more effective. But what I'd like to start with, and thank you everybody for pre-submitting some questions. I will try to address them throughout the event, but as Sally said, please feel free to type in anything you like. It's really much better if I can sort of start to look at and respond to some of the ideas or observations, or if there's something you want to share that's even not a question, I welcome it. Likewise, when I talk about, oh, we're not sure what that noise is. Hopefully it's nothing, because there's nothing in the background, but if there is something that is a problem, please let me know. I will continue to talk, and then if we need to do something else, Sally, please let me know. I hopefully don't want this to be problematic for the audience. But most importantly, when I work with clients, I always ask them what their sticky question or what their sticky issue is. And we have lots of them that hang around. And most importantly, they can be strategic or tactical. they can be known or acknowledged, they can be murky or undefined. They can also be really positive. What are the things that we're not achieving? And one of the situations that I have come to appreciate more than anything else in the work that we've been doing is that there is no naughty or there's no nice. We are aware of changing dynamics in our business environments, and we are always in a position where we can start to look at how we can shift the behaviors we have. And from our perspective, that really has to do with understanding the shifting knowledge landscape. And without knowledge, without people to contribute to the institutional knowledge and to use the institutional knowledge, we just simply don't have any organization. So what I'd like to do is just go through what I hope to accomplish, and it's a tall order in an hour and a half to explore these three areas, but I want to make this an opportunity to invite any of you who have any questions that are not addressed during the session to reach out to Sally and or me personally, and I'm happy to have a conversation with you. But very briefly, there is a shifting knowledge capital landscape, and from the questions that were already submitted, I understand some consistencies around how do we look at what we don't know. It's one thing to know the known knowns, but when we know that we don't know something, then we have a different set of questions to consider. The second is the complexity story in your organization's ecosystem. This will really apply to the work that I have been doing with my colleague Larry Solo in the complexity space consulting. And although we have focused on very traditional process improvement, Lean Six Sigma, organization design and development work, we became very interested in how behavioral complexity science or human systems dynamics really is an underlying foundation of how organizations work, and even more importantly, how we can start to understand and influence the actions in the organizations. So I won't go into too deep an explanation of the complexity component, although I could probably go on for hours just on that one topic alone. But I do think it's really important to how you can immediately start to influence change. And then the third is, how do you want to build an enterprise knowledge strategy to institutionalize your firm's flow of knowledge? And I think that this is really where many of you, specifically in the questions that were submitted, started to focus immediately. And because it's very tactical, I will go through some specific steps, but again, it really is based on the sort of where you are in your organization and where you want to go. But I hope that I'll be able to at least leave you with a set of questions and a set of possible next steps. But the reason why many of you and many of the organizations that I work with focus on this sort of tactical approach is because we're also being confronted with and bombarded with information and then demands from our clients on how can you turn data into action. Everyone is focused on big data. If people don't have a data analytics strategy, they think that this is the magic bullet. It's an important part of how we explore our knowledge capital landscape, but it isn't the magic bullet. They're also questioning on how can we turn our challenges or our opportunities into those uncovered gems. And one of the things that we really believe, and it has sort of brought us originally to a client feedback tool, was that if you focus on great questions rather than great answers, you're going to uncover both what you don't know and the nuances of what you know and how you can immediately sort of interact and react to your client's needs. So the three issues that make this third point most challenging for organizations is that there's generally more information that can be integrated into that shared organizational knowledge than you have the capacity or you even know exist. So if you think about all of the different places where people are gathering and creating new knowledge, you will understand how challenging that can be. There are often a lack of systems within the firm to organize and share this information. And then the third is you're not sure who knows what, so how do you gather the information you need? And those 3 points were repeated in different forms throughout the questions that were submitted ahead of time. So I will move forward. And hopefully, Sally, everything is fine from the noise and feedback end, but please let me know. I particularly find this quote to resonate with what we're going to be talking about today, but then even more importantly, what I am certain may be the challenges that every single person who's out there is understanding. So we are continually shifting between how do we develop our people, processes, products, and strategy when the sources of economic value move from stocks of knowledge, and that's the procedures, documents, sort of the traditional way that we operate, to flows of new knowledge. And the flows of new knowledge is where we become cognizant of and need to recognize the possibilities of how complex systems are influencing how we conduct our business. So when we have tactic knowledge becomes more valuable than explicit knowledge, then this is where leaders start to really focus their attention. So what do I really mean by this? And by the way, if you have not read The Power of Pull, it's a wonderful book. It's applicable to almost any industry, and it really shows how the marketing and providing of services in this new information and networked economy has changed some of the ways that we need to operate. So there has traditionally been 3 operational levels of knowledge that people have worked with. And I think most of you will be familiar, but I think this does sort of establish sort of the criteria of how we've been organized in our institutions around institutional knowledge. So it's the know what. We call this the cognitive knowledge, and this is the essential disciplinary knowledge that's achieved through training, studies, and formal qualifications. So specifically in an engineering and architectural field, these are really essential, and I don't have to explain that to anybody, but you understand that when you have very formal qualifications and training, there's sometimes an understanding or a belief that this is enough. Even if you have to do continuing education, there is a reliance on this know-what knowledge. Then there's the know-how, and I call this the nuances. This is where we may know how to do the tango, but the know-how is when it becomes fluid and it's not machine-like. So it's the practical application. The learning at the know-what is translated into doing. It's how we take this very technical qualifications, training, and studies, and we do something with it. And this is also where professional knowledge adds value in an organization through the ability to translate the theoretical into execution. And then the third is the know why. And we will be looking at this know why because I think that this is where it's most dynamical and fluid. It's the deep knowledge of the web of the cause and effect relationships underlying or supporting an action. And what I mean by this is where professionals can move beyond the execution of tasks to solve those larger and more complex problems. And this is also where engagement and feedback and a continual flow of knowledge is most valuable. And it goes beyond the nuances. It really allows organizations and companies to start to fine-tune and make immediate adjustments and changes to how they're doing things. It does not have to shift the basic premise or foundation of how an organization operates, but it allows you to be very agile. And I wish that we had a poll here, because this is the point where I would normally ask folks, what are some of the terms that you're using in your organization that you find that your clients are sort of relying on? So there's, agile software development, agile management. There's adaptive processes. There's, quality and control. But all of these are starting to shift and morph based on the types of information and the sort of the new ways and expectations that are within client systems. So from that perspective, one of the things that I find most interesting is that when we talk about knowledge capital, and again, knowledge capital, I believe, is one of the essential drivers of business today. So to understand both what you have and what is needed by your clients, you are probably using a combination of knowledge that's either articulated or not, tactic or explicit, information, and information can be very technical. It's the reliance upon which many engineering, technical, and architectural firms sort of structure their business processes. Learning both formal and informal continuing education, also learning about what is specific and unique to the organization. Networks. And networks to me are one of the more interesting new emergences within this knowledge environment. You have very formal networks that we use within professional networks, professional continuing education. You can also have informal networks, and these are where you would have discussion boards, feedback from clients, internal lunch groups, meetings, lunch and learn, but also then formal training within the organization. And then the underlying or pervasive systems. How do you get information? How are you tabulating it? How are you using your data? How are you interacting and connecting with your projects? And each of these will help influence something that we call EEER. And it's the experience, the expectations, the engagements, and the responses in the system. So each and every person who is within an organization, as well as each and every person who you respond to, has different experiences, different expectations, different engagements, and then responses. So I'm going to pause here for a moment because it appears that Sally is hearing a clicking sound and I don't know where it is. So what I'd like to do is just invite any of you to, if you have any questions, to type them in. And I am going to just mute my phone for a moment, my microphone for a moment, and see if I can somehow maybe adjust the volume. This is a little bit helpful. I've tried to decrease my volume. I am not hearing anything on my end, so Sally, if anybody else is hearing a particular noise problem, if they could let you know, that would be terrific. I'd appreciate that. And if there are any questions, likewise, please feel free to put them in now. So now I'm going to go on to a discussion that becomes a little bit more tactical. And there are, again, we could spend, a full day workshop or training session and really understanding and designing a knowledge capital strategy. But what's really important from my perspective is to have a better and deeper understanding of why it's essential to how you operate and how you're doing your business. So one of the things that we think is really essential that people are not focusing on when they think of knowledge capital, or specifically information flows internally and externally, is how does it really support your complex social structures and human dynamics? How does it involve the whole system? And we mean that that includes your vendors, your customers, all levels of management and your employees, and even the external places where interaction and information and knowledge exchanges can happen. It increases commitment and energy, and again, there has been a number of questions that came in that really talked about how do you get people engaged, and we will go through that in a little bit. But what we want to do is look at how can you have, I will call, fluid processes for institutional knowledge, where everyone is valued for sharing and for taking the next step in making sure that what they know, even if they don't recognize it as an important part of the organization's knowledge, that they're able to share it. It connects people and ideas, and generally it creates better solutions, because the more people involved in the conversation, the end result will have a richer and more varied dynamic. Knowledge networks, I can't emphasize enough how important the knowledge networks are for how you conduct business. And we can talk a little bit, if we have time later, about how these networks can also be influenced by the outside, specifically your clients. And when they become part of an ongoing network of knowledge and learning exchanges, everyone seems to be able to benefit from that. And then finally, it speeds up implementation. So there's a sense of having information and knowledge to make decisions, and you're not sort of putting it through sort of a process that limits the exchanges. So if you think back to the previous slide where we had the experience, the expectations, engagements, and responses, we think of that as a continual flow of actions and reactions at all points, at all times in the system. Then it offers you an opportunity to realize that at any point people can be making small and incremental changes, and that the bigger changes will come quicker. But we will go through that as well. So today we have, and I've said it in a multitude of different ways, but I think that when I am asked why knowledge capital has become such an important part of the conversation, I also tell people that it's because we are now living in an environment and working in an environment that is increasingly more complex from an awareness standpoint. It has always been complex. It isn't all of a sudden our lives were simple and now they're complex. We just have greater awareness, and that greater awareness has come from the fact that we have shifting information sources, we have new networks, we have rapid iterations of what we know, how our opinions, and how even procedures and ways to do things have changed. We have continuous adaptation, and this continuous adaptation really comes from the new information, how people are sharing it, and how we have to adjust our behaviors accordingly. And we also have bigger, easily accessible, and continually added to data repositories. And this goes back to the data analytics conversation that I had mentioned earlier. I will be sharing a little bit more about this, but when people talk about a knowledge management or knowledge capital strategy, they often refer to the accessing, storing, searching, organizing, sharing, collaborating, communicating, and then driving that knowledge, information, learning through the organization. So just by saying each of those steps, you understand that it really becomes a very fluid and interactive process. In many ways, it's interdependent on each other. So the storing, as an example, is interdependent on how you want to design the access and the search capabilities. It also is sort of driven by what are the organizing and sharing components of this. And this really becomes a technical conversation, which I'm happy to have with anybody, but what I would like to do is focus more on just sort of the framework and the conversations that can be had around this. So when when we have thank you, Sally, for sharing with me, because I've been sort of looking at the audio. When we have a continuous knowledge flow, and I've worked a long time to simplify this process, because it can become overwhelming. And in my mind, there are three important areas. One are the influences, and I think you'll appreciate this, because Sally and I had gone back and forth when we were talking about different ways to approach some of the conversations during today's presentation. And the influences are also influencers. So I would, in those beautiful little green bubbles, I would include clients internally and externally. So if you have a drafting group within an architectural firm, the project manager may be a client, and then obviously external clients. Leadership, and the leadership comes from both an internal and external environment. External influences that are social, industry, networks, trends, innovations, staff, thought leaders, vendors, competitors. And if you think that each of these can emerge from, the previous slide where we were talking about the networks, we were talking about, data repositories, shifting information sources. You can see how these influences are really pervasive and will continually be influencing your organization and, quite frankly, your organizational capital. On the other side, left-hand side, on the right-hand side, you have your actions. So if you consider the fact that any and all of these influences are driving how you think about and how you use organizational capital, and that capital is being used to drive actions that are strategic, showing the direction of the firm, how you want to proceed, maybe looking at different ways to implement projects or expand your services. Tactical, what are the immediate next steps to take? And please, we'll go through the tactical in a little more detail when we go through the case study. And then adaptive. So adaptive being there's a continuous dialogue that is occurring between your organization, the influences and influencers, and then what are the right, smart next steps to take. So with this, I'd like to then go on to a deeper conversation about the organization's ecosystem. And the reason why this is critical to how you look at your knowledge capital, and I'm going to go back for a moment, and how you look at the influences, the actions, and this wonderful middle part, which is where your operational structure occurs. We need to look at what we think our organizations are, what they may really be, and recognize that there's two different perspectives. So whenever I throw this slide up, people sort of start to smile, and I see heads nodding in the audience if I'm there person to person. But what I have found is that it resonates with everybody. And specifically with a technical audience, but more importantly, most of our organizations and social systems were built on and predicated on a machine philosophy. If you have the parts, if it's well designed, you can replace them, you can keep your operational standards at a very high level, and the only thing that will sort of disturb or disrupt the production will be if the machine completely breaks down, but if you're very clever, you probably have a backup, or if it's replaced by a second machine. On the right-hand side, you'll see that there's this lovely garden. We should all be so lucky to have a garden like this. But what's really important is you see that there is less of a cause and effect, less of a structure to this garden, and the two is the machine and the organic garden perspectives. But it's because we like to operate as mechanics. We like to create our detailed blueprint and follow the strict rules, or I would just say the rules that we think will lead us to success. We like to find out what's wrong and fix it, and it's understandable that we'd like to have strong expectations regarding the effect of the actions. So in a mechanistic machine organizational structure, mechanics are the winners, and they are relied upon to provide the next steps because they can fix things and they can tell you what's going to happen. But what I've come to find through the research and working with organizations across a multitude of different domains, and I do a lot of software development work and startups, and there tends to be a very structured approach. But we also are recognizing that in today's business environments, our organizations really probably represent more of a garden, and they have the complex organic properties of an ecosystem. So that we recognize as gardeners, we can't always control what's going to happen. Even if we use the most genetically sophisticated seeds, it may not produce exactly what we think is going to be produced. We have to recognize that there are critical few variables that can be used to influence patterns, and we have to take current actions recognizing long-term implications. So what this really provides for us are two different views of how knowledge can be looked at within organizations. I like to call it the both and. One, we need to have the blueprint. We need to have a certainty for many of the products and services that we provide to our clients. We need to be able to fix things. But at the same time, we need to be able to understand that when things happen that are outside of our control that we had not anticipated, that we can have new models and methods in which to address these issues and still have, with a fairly high level of confidence, a deliverable and outcomes that will be both satisfactory to the leadership or the management as well as our clients. Within the mechanistic machine model, we recognize that there are many linear relationships. There are multitudes of parts, and that it is built from this blueprint, and that our goal is really the consistency and duplication of the same thing time and time again. But within the garden metaphor, there are fewer parts, there are a lot of nonlinear relationships. So the environment and the water, the soil quality, the types of seeds to really extend this beyond to the next step. It's holistic, and that means that when you are looking at the outcomes, you're looking at the whole. It's very hard to just sort of plug and play, if you may. It's emergent, and that's a really important word in the conversations that we have, because within an emergent environment, you're continually looking for what is just about to happen. And some of the sort of steps that we'll talk about later will allow us to address that in greater detail. But when you're looking at knowledge capital and how people are using, sort of tactic knowledge to make decisions, the concept of being able to work through something as it's happening is really critical. Likewise, the skills in which to work within this ecosystem, this garden environment, tend to be a little different than from a mechanical perspective. And part of it is because they want to support a coherent knowledge strategy. And I use the word coherent, not that it needs to have every step, every procedure completely identified, but in the sense of it makes sense, and that as something is changed, it is not completely disruptive to something else. So it's having both vision and realistic expectations. It's considering the past, the present, and the future almost at the same time. So what we've done in the past is obviously relevant to what's happening today and will also affect the decisions that we make in the future. It's persistence. If it doesn't work now, let's keep trying it. And again, I do understand that if there are really specific regulatory compliance issues, that persistence has to be driven to a much higher and sort of explicit action. And awareness is of the differences that make a difference. And we use that term because it allows greater flexibility and decision-making and influencing by the individuals who are working on a project. So if they felt that what was really important was that everybody had coffee at 10:30 in the morning because it allowed for informal sharing information, that could potentially be a difference that had a higher success rate or greater satisfaction within, within a project. And being able to recognize that and see how it can be applied on a scalable level is really important. And then obviously continually adapting to changing conditions. I'm going to stop for a moment and see if there are any questions. Sally, so please feel free to let me know. Okay. So each of our organizations have, and I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Again, this is really more of a foundational discussion. But I think when you think back to your sticky issues, and when I think, and I'm going to address some of the questions that were submitted earlier, they really have to do with our, or the unique ecosystem of the organization. The organization has a history, context, and culture. And even if that organization is relatively new, there are traditions and significant ways of doing things and milestones that start to, I think of it as starting to define who we are. The context is the surroundings which you operate. So if you're operating in an architectural environment where you're doing very large commercial projects, that's the context in which you're going to be making your decision from competitive as well as from a process and material perspective. And then the culture is who and what the system is at its core. So if the culture is, and this is a very easy example, but if the culture is that we're very informal, that we don't wear suits and ties in the office, but we do when we're with clients,
it starts to define how you operate, and these I call them very subtle signals that happen in the interactions and reactions within the system. But one of the things that's really important is that these are really deeply embedded, and we can't just say we're going to change our history, we're going to change the context, or we're going to change the culture of who we are, and assume that just because we say we're going to do it, even if we put new systems and procedures in place, there's a lot of resistance to changing these what we call very deeply embedded patterns within the organization. So, for example, one of the questions was that it's hard to pull out common knowledge that individuals who are engaged in a project know but are not sharing. So the question is, if there was a pattern of not having lots of communication, or having ways where project notes, even if they aren't formalized, are put into a repository where they can be shared. Or more importantly, if there's been a behavior in the organization that you're rewarded for knowing something versus rewarded for sharing and collaborating, those are very different ways in which people are going to respond. So if you do not encourage or have different approaches and strategy for getting feedback internally as well as externally, that may sort of create this way of doing things which doesn't have a free flow of information. Likewise, if you're in a group where everybody is expected to really focus on what they're doing, so think of some of the languaging that's happening. You want quiet, you want to be able to be in your workspace, and you have your headsets on, and you're really doing sort of that deep thinking work. There's a sense of it's very much who you are, what you're doing, what your deliverable is, and it may be different than if there's an open workspace, everybody's working at long tables, the sharing is more fluid, and there's a sense of ideas are really put out there for the good of the entire organization, and that everybody is asked to participate and respond and to engage around them. And there are a number of really very specific ways you can do this, but those are, from my perspective, those are behaviors that probably are pervasive around an entire organization, and shifting those can be more difficult. But there's a way in which you can start to look at shifting things on an immediate basis. So when we look at, and we call these our ecosystem levers, so these are the levers that you can start to push in the ecosystem. This is how do you empower these individuals to start to shift their own behaviors to get what they need, and hopefully to share what they can within the organization. From a knowledge standpoint, it's really important, because here is where you can start to have immediate shifts in how you're sharing, how you're accessing, storing, codifying, and using information. And I do want to note that this can also apply not only to within an organization internally, but absolutely externally. And to some extent, one of the exciting things about being asked to be here today and thinking about the client feedback tool and that software is that this is really where the adaptive action occurs based on that feedback that you're getting from your clients, because you can start to immediately apply any one or all four of these areas. So we looked at these four areas because we felt that they were really critical and easily understandable by almost any organization. So the concept of having connections, experiments, diversity, and influencership is really critical in how you start to have both individual, team, and organization-wide behavior change. So one of the things that we look at is creating and expanding new intersections of people, ideas, and resources. I often think that it's at the intersections that we find the greatest energy. So if you look at, I am working on a particular project, it is overlapping or is crossing over somebody else's project. If I pause there long enough, I may actually be able to ask some new questions and get new information, which is going to give me an opportunity to make any sort of movement forward adjustments that will be beneficial to the product and to the client. Related to that is the concept of being able to incent curiosity. I call it intelligent risk-taking and learning from experiments. So this allows people to increase their tolerance and actually to start to embrace taking new risks. So we call it sort of fail fast, fail often, learn always. But it opens up the possibility of using knowledge about what worked and what didn't work, and having people feel that they have the right and that they should be experimenting within that. So one of the questions that had been submitted ahead of time was that there was some hesitancy and concern about how do you allow people to to be able to try new things if there isn't already a behavior where they're sharing and allowing their insights to be publicly shared amongst the group. So I consider that it's sometimes very risky to sort of articulate and voice concerns or questions, specifically if everyone's supposed to already know the answers, and we all know that we don't know those answers. So that if you can set up a way for there being these open engagement forums for a sharing, I call it storytelling, and I mean that in a really positive way. What worked, what didn't work? What was the story behind the project? So, sometimes if you start to look at a deeper understanding of the project, then that gives you sort of coloring the nuances, and it also allows you to start to ask different questions. And then when we talk about diversity, it's really looking at any and all ideas. So a perfect example of this, there was a project that I had worked on, and we were looking at increasing the or I should say actually it was lowering the infectious rates within emergency rooms. And what you wouldn't necessarily think is that you would bring in a diverse group of people to have this conversation. So not only the patient's family, the doctors, the nurses, but we brought in the janitorial staff, we brought in the food services staff. And quite interestingly, the janitor said, it's interesting because you have, a waste receptacle only in one area. So why wouldn't you have one inside, then have one outside, and just make sure that, there's a continuance of being able to remove them so that you're not bringing germs from one area into the other. So it may sound somewhat simple, but we tend to think of it specifically as we're more, qualified, and the higher level of our sort of skills and professionalism comes, we tend to think in that mode, and sometimes we just need to have someone who isn't addressing problems the same way that we are. And then last but not least, and again, this goes back to some of the questions that folks have already posted, is that I like to consider shifting the role of leadership to influencership. And so we all have an opportunity to influence what we're doing specifically, what our teams are doing, by sharing knowledge and making sure that we are intentional about keeping track of what worked, what didn't work. So if we start to re-envision that role of accountability, responsibility, and influencership, then it gives people an opportunity to feel that what they're contributing really is making a difference, and that they have as much to gain by what other people are contributing as they can by contributing back into the system. So I'm going to just very quickly go through these because, as usual, I want to make sure that we have time to get through the whole presentation. And again, I've already mentioned the fact that the ecosystem dimensions are not predictably influenced, that they are very deeply embedded patterns. They may not be immediately visible, and they're open to external systems, but at the same time, those shifts are much slower. And the levers, which we just went through and discussed, shares the fact that they're always present, that they're operating throughout the organization, but you can pull them. You can bring different people into conversation for diversity. You can start to reward risk-taking. They can be modified directly. There's a specific action. You can change way meetings are being held, and you can measure it. Was that successful? Wasn't it successful? If it's not, then you can try something differently the next time. And then even more importantly, there's much shorter feedback cycles. So when you think about using feedback internally or externally, the information that you're getting back from the respondents is really important because it can provide you some tactical moves that you can make across any one of the ecosystem levers, and I will refer back to this during the case study. And then even more importantly, I never forget, it's at the front of my mind, not at the back of my mind at all times, but we need to continually consider our outcomes. And it's hard to, because I tend to also be very financially oriented when I'm working on a project with a client. I want to make sure that they have a return on their investment internally as well as externally. And so we talk a great deal about the the linear outcomes that we are meeting, sort of traditional quality, cost, timeliness, and compliance. And we will never forget those. But at the same time, there's a way in which to measure and start to put into the conversation and into the expectations new dynamic outcomes. So how are we changing commitment and discretionary effort around engagement? Are we creating formal and informal connections through networks? Can we respond to internal and external demands with agility? And are we changing the future options for action? These are the pattern shifts. And again, it goes back to, are you providing and are you setting the conditions in which to have a greater input of knowledge exchange, knowledge use, and knowledge outcomes in the organization? And this is where I think many of you will start to understand this key pattern shift, and the three areas that I have been referring to as strategic, tactical, and adaptive really can be applied for almost any objective in the organization. So we're talking about knowledge capital, organizational knowledge, but if I put another subtitle here, you would probably find it equally as relevant. And the reason why is that these 5 areas have always been present in any strategic conversation that we have. Also, from the tactical and adaptive perspectives, we continually go back to these. So if we look at the mindset, if the mindset is passive, yeah, we're doing okay, we can probably do better, but it's not broken. If we can shift that to being intentional and collaborative, you will start to be able to bring more information to the system. You'll start to be able to shift some of those behaviors. From a development standpoint, the development can be both on products, it can be on services, it can be even on processes internally. If it's waterfall, here's what we're going to do. We're going to push it down into the organization. And you move it instead to an agile, responsive procedure or way of doing it, it becomes much more engaged oriented for the organization. So you're responding to how people are participating in the development, and likewise you're also allowing them a voice in what happens. Likewise, from a structure, if your organization is very siloed, and there's no naughty or nice here, so siloed can be very appropriate in many circumstances. It will, if you start to shift that to an integrated structure, it means that there's the opportunities for greater engagement, diversity and sharing of ideas across the different levels. From a technology standpoint, if it's monolithic, here's our system, we're not changing it, or oh my gosh, if I want to change, it's going to be 3 months later, to a system where it's flexible and adaptive. And I want to stop. I am not criticizing monolithic technology systems. Having created monolithic enterprise technology systems and then recognizing that what took hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to do 7 or 8 years ago can now be done for 1/100th of the investment, because we have a cloud-sourced and shared technology resources. But it also has a lot to do with how we're thinking about sharing and developing, sort of these knowledge repositories. So, let's look for something that's flexible and adaptive, specifically when you're going through the analysis stage. And then from a leadership, you have a leadership that, and I call this the flattened organization syndrome, that is connected with as few steps as possible to anyone in the organization. It becomes more visible and more cohesive, and these are really important because this is where the informal sharing and knowledge exchange can happen. So I'm going to pause here, and then I will go on to the next slide. If there's any questions. Okay. This sort of sums up at this point in time the concept of, in the complex environment, what do you really want to accomplish when you're looking at your knowledge strategy? And there are 3 terms that may be new relative to this context, but are particularly relevant, because what you want to do is you want to make sure these 3 things are continually being evaluated as you look at how you're going to shift your organization. 1, and we love the word robustness, because you want to make sure that no matter what happens, that your organization is robust enough to do what it does best. So there's feature persistence across your organizational shifts. So if you are an engineering firm, you're all of a sudden not going to throw out every single manual, CAD design software, and regulatory book, and say, hey, we're going to be just much more agile, and we're going to be really creative and innovative. You have to make sure that you have the foundation, you have the structure to do what you need to do. But at the same time, the agility means that within this robust, structured organization, you can encourage people to take, to influence, to take risks, to engage in new ways of thinking around meeting external and internal demands. And so if all of a sudden everybody, all the clients you're going to work with are using iPads or tablets, and what's important is that you want to be able to have any of your shared resources that are exchanged through the internet visible on tablets, you may need to invest or consider that. So these are sort of agile shifts. They aren't earth-shattering, but over time they may actually start to change some of that feature persistence across the organization. And then you need to consider the fact that even as your organization is changing and you're shifting new ways of doing things, maybe even entering new markets, that there is enough resilience that as the internal, external changes occur, that the organization at its core is going to survive. And I think I go back to the organizational ecosystem. If you understand your history, culture, and context, even if those deeply embedded patterns start to shift, if you know what they are and can have engagements and conversations around them, you can create an environment of resilience that will allow the organization to change and will allow it to survive. And it may not look like it looks today. I think this is particularly relevant when there are merger and acquisition environments, but at the same time, it starts to surface what is valued, what are the stories that make the most difference, and how can the people who have been working in the system or joining the system start to have this sort of shared language. And I put this in here. This really becomes sort of what are the next steps that you can take when you're actually building and supporting an iterative process for knowledge capital. These can be very tactical, and they're somewhat self-explanatory, but the reason I put this in there is after you leave, or if we have any further conversations, this will just give you some points in which you can say, here's some areas that we don't have clarity on, here's what we do well, here's where we need to look at new alternatives. So I think that what's really important here is that each and every one of them, underlying them, really encourages that engagement, really encourages the openness and the opportunity in which to get feedback and perspectives from everybody. And based on the questions that were sent in earlier, here's where, if you just went through this and said, are we assessing the knowledge? Are we looking at what our practices are? Do they still make sense, or do we have everything in file cabinets? Are we engaging all our key stakeholders? And, when we look at our tools and techniques, what can't we get rid of, or what can we change that would make it easier for the user? And then, are there incentives for using this knowledge? Does it go to the fact that the more information that folks are sharing, the better it is for everybody? Or do you actually say, if you make sure that you fill in all of your project management observations, then after the project is ended, everybody will get a Starbucks card? So I think that there's a really important way in which to have this conversation around supporting knowledge capital. Part of it is awareness. Part of it is continual engagement, and also understanding what works in your organization and continually trying new ways in which to address each of these areas. So if I had to leave you with 4 questions, and we're not at the end, but I think this is a good point, because I use this as this is where feedback for the Agile practices is most important. I ask these 4 questions almost too many times, but I don't think there can be too many times. Whenever we've reached sort of a milestone, or I would call it sort of a pause, or we're at an intersection. And this is where that feedback and engagement is so critical to how we proceed forward. So if you simply ask, what was their experience? And there's no pre-qualified answer, but what was the experience? And you may find that people even interpret, sort of the parameters of the experience differently, and that can help inform how you take that next step. Were their expectations of how we did the job or the project the same or different? And did they shift over the course of time? What were the engagements that mattered? And this is where you can start to have some really specific nuances or directions on how you want to share and open up the opportunities to get knowledge and to share knowledge back or learning throughout the project. And how did we manage rapidly changing responses? So if everyone loved us at the beginning of the project, we're a little bit shaky in the middle, can we get them back to loving us at the end of the project? And part of this is that you're continually going to take an action. You're going to get feedback. Take the action, get feedback. It's continuing. And that's really, at its core, what knowledge is all about. It's this continuous, iterative process, and that becomes an agile practice. I'm taking an action. I need to know what happens with it. I'm taking the action. And if you just went through these 4 questions at multiple stages during a project, you would start to find that it will direct where you need to focus your energies on capturing, storing, sharing different knowledge. So here's where I always have the most fun. So Sally was really gracious during our multitudes of conversations and providing me with some information on a client case from client feedback tools. And I want to note that I always think it's important to put whatever we're talking about into context. And I will tell you that I couldn't have asked for a more appropriate case, because this is really everything that we've been talking about to this point. It really sort of emphasizes what actually happened. And when we go through this, I will try to bring in some of the other comments that folks have shared. But if you're asking for feedback, if you think about and ask everybody and anybody, you know, sometimes it's a matter of how do you balance time when you have a tremendous constraint on how much time you have. The feedback, unless it's very controlled, can become, you know, a huge pull on resources and attention. But what I do suggest is that it's really important to make sure and to look at the varying levels of feedback you can have. So very structured feedback on a repetitive or iterative basis is really important, because you can start to notice patterns within the feedback. And then if it becomes important, both internally with the folks who are working on the project or externally with the clients, you can then create sort of one-off, deeper conversations. And I know that some of the folks who shared questions before the session made a comment about how do you really make the time to develop strategies to get this information and this knowledge exchange. And feedback is just, I would call it as the Twitter of learning and knowledge exchanges and information exchange, because it tends to be, you know, the shorter duration, but it feeds important, literally feeds important content into the system. And that the engagement strategy around what you get back in the form of formal or even informal feedback will really allow you to start to shift how you're approaching your project. So with this client, and I'm going to go forward and not come back, these are questions that were asked, and most importantly, the additional feedback in the text box is what sort of directed the next steps in the iterations on how this particular firm was responding to the needs. Someone said it would be great to have more presence on site. Not that they were dissatisfied with the work that they were getting or the quality. Everything else was pretty well within expectations, but someone made a comment that they would like to have more presence on site. So what the firm did was make an investment, a non-billable investment, to have a project manager on site 2 to 3 times per week. And depending on the needs of the client or the you know, the project, it could have been for a few hours, it could have been for half a day. During that time period, 8 tremendous amount of informal as well as formal knowledge and learning occurred. There were opportunities to meet with groups in the client on the client site that provided valuable information on how to proceed next. There was an opportunity to make these small incremental adjustments and to encourage experimentation so that people can say, you know, something we think that next week what we're going to do is we're going to bring everybody from this team to work with this team, and while we're doing that, let's see if we can come up with a, you know, a viable revision to the plan or to the project. What's really important is that it served an immediate need, but it also completely shifted how the client was using the firm. And within a very short period of time, that client started to rely more heavily on the firm, and they increased their billables per month. So even more importantly, the outcomes, which may have been sort of these dynamic outcomes that I had referred to before, actually translated into deliverables to the bottom line. So they were very traditional outcomes that we all like to have within our organizations, and clearly feel is important as we go forward for the next project. So if you think about asking these practice questions, all of a sudden you can get some really specifics on how did the experience change, what were their expectations, and what were the engagements that we hadn't occurred or hadn't planned for before, and how do we manage these responses. And I think that that only comes by having an ongoing platform and opportunity for feedback. So as we have about 15 more minutes, so this is where we're going to wind down just a little bit, because I'd like you to, again, think about any of the questions or sticky issues that you may have thought about during the first hour of the presentation. And what I'd like to do is to look at something very tactical on how to shift the behavior patterns. And this really does relate to the knowledge in your organization. And so it could be for virtually any new way to look at having a more adaptive, iterative approach to managing a product or project. But specifically for knowledge, this is a great way in which to say, how do we look at increasing those flows of knowledge in the organization? So I do understand and appreciate the fact that some people may be at the very early stages of understanding where do they store the information, what are the things they should be sharing and storing, and that, again, as I said, becomes very, very structural and very tactical. I'm happy to have that conversation with anybody. But I think that if you start to ask these types of questions and look at surfacing some of the frustrations or actually some of the things that are happening that you don't even know about, then you may have a clearer direction of what's valuable. So, for example, if everybody is already sharing informally what worked, what didn't work on a project, if the junior engineers have their own private online way of sharing information, just because it gives people an idea of, oh, what happened at site number 2? It's a similar project to what we're working on. Can I apply to site number 3? Once you can start to surface those behaviors, then that will also give you an idea of what do you really need in the overall organization. But what I'd like to go through here is we can think about the previous client case. So what were the things that they did that really shifted the patterns in the project and then ultimately within the entire organization? So they decided to focus on the experience of having a project manager on site. what were the connections that were created? Well, that project manager got to know a lot more people in the organization. The organization got to know the project manager. So if they had a need or question or new project, they had actually somebody who they had already developed a connection and relationship with. From an experiment standpoint, it was an opportunity to say, you know, we're not limiting anything you want to try. So if what you really want to do is to have everybody have the project managers cell phone numbers so that they can text them 24/7. This didn't happen, so I do want you to know that we would never suggest that, but that could be an intelligent failure, if you may. So the project manager may say, I haven't slept in 4 weeks, and you may decide that that's not a right way to do it. But what it did do was gave you a new way of letting people know when something was happening so that there weren't long lag times between the problem or the issue and the response. The diversity, and this did happen from the engagement standpoint, was bringing lots of different functions together to brainstorm. So one way to do that would be to look at, even if that person was not directly related to the team working on the project, either from the service provider or the client side, maybe it would be appropriate if they invited people who only had sort of ancillary or sort of boundary participation. So the people who are in that gray area. So it could be someone from accounting, or it could be someone from the administrative support staff who could be sharing information or have a better understanding of what's expected, what the time frames, or the pace of the project is. Again, if you can bring different functions together to brainstorm a solution, and then what you're doing is you're getting a lot of diversity of ideas, opinions, and probably a better and stronger solution and greater buy-in. And last but not least is the concept of the influence ship. If there's an expectation that everything has to go through a very long and detailed approval process, if you can shift it so that for certain types of projects or components of a project you can shift who has the approval authority, that starts to shift the expectation. So people may be less reluctant to pose ideas or to suggest things that they normally would have said, oh my God, it's going to take 3 months in which to get this approval, so I'm not going to even bring it up. And I'm sure that many of you have heard that type of conversation in the past. So it's hard to do it in this format, but what I'd like to suggest is that when you go back, and hopefully you'll share some of these ideas, or if you have any other questions, I'd really think this is a great sort of format for starting to put different ideas into the individual boxes. And the funny part of this is that they're all there all the time, that there's no one particular area that has predominance over any other area or box. We all have experiences which are based on expectations of what's happened in the past and what we think is going to happen in the future. We're engaging, even if it's a very small group of people, we're continually engaging in order to get the information and to know what do we do, how can we do it best. And we have responses. We have responses based on what is happening around us, and the people that we're influencing, we have impact on, will have responses that will influence what we do next. And so if we can start to look at what are some of the things that happen across all 4 of these sort of top-level columns, then we really can start to shift some important behaviors, and I really think that we would start to create a more fluid exchange of information and hopefully services to our clients, because that's really what most of our businesses are about. And again, this one slide could probably keep all of us in conversation for a very long period of time. But again, what I hope that it illustrates is that it's all interconnected, and that we're continually looking at a variety of different areas where we can focus our attention. But what's really important is that you're going to address one at a time. And then as you have a more coherent knowledge strategy, or you decide to experiment with one or two different approaches to engagements within your organization, or allowing people to make decisions at certain levels, then what you'll find is that you're going to start to get new information that's going to guide you as you go through the next set of questions and the next set of opportunities. So I think that you can find that the sticky issues can start coming off of the screen, although I can guarantee, it's the only thing that I can ever guarantee anybody is there are going to be new ones, because there's always opportunities. And as I said, sticky issues can be an opportunity, not just something negative. Okay, so I think that Sally has asked a question which I'm going to answer. How can technology support or enable improving knowledge sharing and management? Thank you. It's a terrific question. And quite easily what it does is it opens up the audiences that can share and can have access to information and knowledge. So if we used to have to access most of our information through printed materials, just now consider the fact that I can probably get anything I need on my laptop, my iPhone, my iPad or tablet, and in addition to the fact that I can connect to a Dropbox or to a cloud-based storage system, and they can be very secure, so I do understand that there's some security issues that people are concerned about. But that I probably am never more than 1 or 2 or 3 clicks away from the information that I need, and that I can get feedback equally as fast from folks as we're trying something. Again, I had mentioned that I've done hundreds or thousands of these sessions, and a lot of the work that I do with clients on an international basis allows me to, to share really very, very specific tactical information and do, sort of project management virtually that couldn't happen before. So what it does, I think, is it flattens out the access. It can overwhelm you with the amounts of information coming through the system, but at the same time, if there is a clarity, and it goes back to the concept of having the sort of robust, resilient, and agile organizational structure, clarity on what you do, what you need to do that can't have too much change and variance, and how you can, within that, respond to the changing environment, then technology makes that all possible. Again, there are new opportunities to do the sharing and the storage, the accessibility at a much lower cost point today than there was even 5 years ago. Let's see if there are any other questions. Okay. So I'm going to conclude with these 3 questions. So I guess, or you will have now gathered that I ask a lot of questions. And I do have answers, but the answers usually somehow include another question embedded in them. But the most important thing that I can leave you with is that you will continually be in a state of inquiry for anything and everything that you do, from implementing or developing your knowledge capital. And if you think about it, we need to put terms on things because people like to have some common reference. But as I started off saying, is that our organizations are made of people, and our people are doing things and they know things, and they're hopefully, you know, in service to the clients and to the products and services that are being offered by the organization. And that is our knowledge. That is the capital that we have, because we could have lots of words and books and videos, but if we didn't have the people to bring them out into the sort of the external world, then we really just wouldn't have viable industries, and we wouldn't have anyone to start to implement and to respond to the changes that happen. So how your organization, division, function, group accesses, uses, and develops knowledge to address the strategic, tactical, and adaptive drivers of the business. You should be asking that on an ongoing basis, whether it's done on a formal basis, like quarterly reviews, or whether that's being done at the end or beginning of each project. And quite frankly, what's getting in the way? So when you ask that, what's currently getting in the way? Again, it may be something that you can't shift immediately, but it may be something that you can start to look at new ways in which to make the shifts. And then what does success look like for you? And I think the shifts and the view of success are both benefit from looking at short cycles. So success for me today may not be what success 2 months from now is, but they both will start to move you into a path of being more responsive to your environments. So I'm pretty much on target, and it's been a pleasure to chat with you today, and thank you very much. And Sally, thank you so much, and thank you to Client Feedback Tool for inviting me. I hope that all of you will feel free to reach out if I can ask any specific questions. And I know that this has been a lot, but it should at least give you some things to think about. And remember, those sticky issues are really at the core of getting new feedback and new options for action.
Thank you, Denise. Can you hear me?
I can.
Great, because I think I was having a little trouble with my audio before. But I do want to thank you so much for this. I'm sure that you're right. There is a lot to think about, but a lot of good information. I'd like to share with our attendees that, as Denise said, we're all, she's about feedback, we're about feedback. So we will be sending you a feedback request just to get some information from you about the webinar, which we will, of course, share with Denise. And I think, Denise, you said you would also be following up with everyone who was on the webinar today. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I believe that Sally had sent out a PDF of the presentation slides. And so if someone did not receive them or you would like them, we can definitely send those out to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, everyone. And Denise, thank you. And we'll talk to you soon. And hopefully we'll see some of the rest of you on a webinar in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.